Welcome back to Combat Mission Shock Force 2. Today we begin the Khabour Trail campaign, which features a battle group from the Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry Regiment, tasked with capturing Al-Hasaka, a strategic Syrian provincial capital vital for its oil and wheat production. This battle group consists of 5 companies, 2 mechanized infantry companies, a light infantry company, a tank company, and a support company. The Canadians will also have 3 sections of 155mm artillery and access to NATO air assets throughout the campaign. Intel expects the Syrian forces to be mostly reserve infantry with a single battalion of special forces. However, since NATO has air superiority, much of the Syrian force has been deployed into populated towns where they can hide from air support. A portion of their infantry has been converted into unconventional Fedayeen fighters who can hide among the civilian population and conduct ambushes within urban areas. The campaign unfolds in 3 distinct phases, focused on securing crosses over the Khabour River in Tall Tamir, Nasri, and Al-Hasaka. In the first phase, C Company, the light infantry, will conduct an airborne assault on the southern outskirts of the town in order to secure the far bank of the river, while simultaneously the 2 mechanized infantry companies, D and E, will capture the bridge crossing and the northern portion of the town, respectively. Assuming they're all successful, Phase 2 will commence with the battle group pushing from Tall Tamir into the town of Nasri in order to capture both the town and the river crossings there. Phase 3 is the attack on Al-Hasaka itself, with the goal of capturing the city, rail stations, and 3 crossings over the river. This battle features C Company, the light infantry company, that has been airlifted to the far side of the Khabour River in order to attack the southern outskirts of the town. D and E companies will be starting their attack shortly, so C Company's goal is to capture a portion of the town in order to split the Syrian forces and make it more difficult for them to defend the bridge. In addition to C Company, A Company has provided a squad of assault pioneers armed with demolition charges. 2 batteries of 155mm artillery, a pair of Hornets with 460kg bombs, and a pair of Apache attack helicopters are all on standby. The battlefield is quite long and fairly narrow, with the Canadian forces dropped off in a field to the west of the objective. The sightlines are wide open, but there are crops offering some concealment on the approach, as well as a couple of depressions that could provide a small amount of cover. At the end of the fields is a paved road running north to south, and just beyond that is a series of compounds with 1-story buildings and low stone walls. The briefing indicated that the buildings here have been abandoned, so I'm free to fire upon these if needed. Since my approach is quite exposed aside from some crops, these buildings have a good view of the end of the field. It may be necessary to hit the area with artillery in order to safely move from the fields into the buildings. Across another open field on the south side of the map is another series of compounds with mostly 1-story buildings and low walls again. However, towards the east are some taller buildings with taller walls. The tall buildings have good line of sight over anything moving across the field in the middle of the 2 sets of compounds, or moving towards the objective, so it'll be important to neutralize any threats here. Recon has identified several likely Syrian positions, but has also noted that this area is free of civilians, so is open to heavy weapon usage. Running between the 2 sets of compounds is a trench, likely used to irrigate the surrounding fields. It's dry, and while it's not very deep, it can easily provide cover for a crouching or prone soldier. That brings us to the edge of Tall Tamir itself. On the easternmost edge is what I believe is a school, a building I was particularly warned about not destroying, and the rest of the area is also populated with civilians, so I need to avoid destroying any of the buildings here. The town itself is nothing too surprising. It has a lot of smaller 1-story buildings packed tightly together, with a few taller buildings mixed in and a couple slightly wider streets running through it. Most of the rooftops on these buildings will be accessible, but only a few of them have a low wall offering protection. Most are flat, and any soldiers moving up to the rooftops will be exposed. The assault into the objective will be conducted in 3 phases. In Phase 1, 8 and 9 platoon will advance up the fields, using the 2 small depressions for cover if needed, and get into a position to take the first compounds in the north. The buildings of the compound should break line of sight from the low buildings in both the town and the south compounds on the opposite side, so it seems like the safest starting point. I also have no partial contacts here, so there's a chance that the buildings are abandoned and I can move in freely. 7 platoon will move up to the edge of the road and spread out, providing covering fire if needed. Once the buildings here are secured, 9 platoon will deploy into the buildings facing the town, while 8 platoon will deploy into the buildings facing the middle field and southern compounds. Phase 2 will have 7 platoon move into the irrigation ditch and push along it to assault and secure the compounds and buildings in the south. 8 platoon will provide the base of fire, allowing 7 platoon to advance. The main goal is to seize all of the buildings overlooking the gap between the 2 compounds and the town, since crossing in the open with fire coming from the sides would be a quick path to disaster. Once all the buildings on the outskirts are cleared and secured, 7 platoon will act as the base of fire while 8 to 9 platoon begin to assault the town. There's a grouping of buildings on the southwest corner of the objective that look pretty isolated from the rest of the town, with only one taller building able to see the approach and a few lower outer buildings. The small stand of trees probably won't help too much, but they also provide another obstacle to break line of sight on the approach. 7 platoon will help suppress these buildings until 8 to 9 platoon can get into them. Afterwards, it will be some brutal urban combat to clear out the rest of the objective area. As the battle begins, 8 and 9 platoon proceed towards the closest group of buildings. Each of the Canadian platoons consists of 3 8-man squads equipped with 6 C7A2 rifles, one of which has an underbarrel grenade launcher, and 2 C9 light machine guns. They also carry several disposable anti-tank launchers. 7 platoon is holding back for now with the company's support teams, 3 60mm mortars, 2 ATGM teams, 2 machine gun teams, and the assault pioneers borrowed from A company. As the platoons advance, they catch sight of the first confirmed enemy, a few unconventional fighters moving between buildings in the southern compound. At this point, though, they are at too great of a range to successfully engage. As 9 platoon continues their advance through the fields, they reach the first of the small depressions, but they haven't come under any fire, so it doesn't seem like it's necessary for them to stop there. However, they do spot in the buildings they're heading towards a couple unconventional fighters fleeing the area. These are leaving the direction that my troops are coming and heading back towards the town. And as the first of the platoon reaches the second small depression, I have them slow down and proceed forward with a hunt order, so they'll be a little bit more cautious and do a better job of spotting as they move forward. Since the lead elements of 9 platoon didn't encounter any Syrians aside from the couple of soldiers fleeing the buildings, I've moved up the rest of 9 platoon and 8 platoon to prepare to secure the buildings. I've also brought up both machine gun teams to provide some additional firepower for the assault. You can also hear the approach of one of the Apaches, which is going to patrol around the southern buildings and fire upon any targets that I can spot. And once again, my infantry catches a glimpse of some of the soldiers that were positioned in the buildings I'm now trying to occupy, fleeing back towards the town. I decide to move 9 platoon into the northernmost buildings first, so they can provide cover for 8 platoon as they push into the buildings where I've seen Syrians fleeing from, just in case some of the Syrian forces have stayed behind in order to ambush my troops. Shortly after, it sounds like my Apaches arrived on the battlefield and is starting to look for targets. I have the Apache set to engage targets in the entire southern set of buildings, as these are all abandoned by civilians. As it circles around, it fires a Hellfire missile into one of the 2-story buildings. It comes around and does another pass, and a short time later fires a second Hellfire into the same building. At least I know that there's something in there, or at least there was something in there. With 9 platoon having secured several buildings, 8 platoon begins their advance into the next row of structures. A couple of fire teams start to move forward with the remainder of the platoon spotting for potential targets. One of the machine gun teams is ordered to open fire into a nearby building, hoping to trigger some return fire if there are any Syrians hiding inside. But so far, there's been no response. As the fire teams move closer, the second machine gun team starts to fire upon one of the buildings the Syrians were seen fleeing from. Again, there is no return fire, so it's starting to look like the Syrians abandoned their positions upon spotting my approaching forces. 9 platoon has completely secured the northernmost section of the compound and has taken positions in the buildings facing the town. One of the squad spots some Syrians on a rooftop, and the C9 gunner fires a few bursts to suppress the target. The range is too far for the riflemen to start firing on their own, and it's a bit too far for the light machine gun too. It's able to suppress, but is unlikely to score many hits from this distance. The spotted Syrian is also armed with an assault rifle, so he isn't able to effectively fire back and takes cover instead. Unfortunately for 9 platoon, this has attracted the attention of a heavy machine gun deployed on the rooftop of one of the 2-story buildings. One of the fire teams is quickly pinned, but so far has avoided any casualties. Several other squads from the platoon spot the heavy machine gun and return fire, mostly with their C9s. Between the range and the low wall, the Canadian return fire is only able to suppress the Syrian gunner. While 9 Platoon engages the rooftop Syrians, the first sections from 8 Platoon have made it to the low wall, allowing the second half of each of the squads to advance and join them. I'm fairly certain all of the Syrians did flee from these buildings, but out of an abundance of caution, I'm going to take it slow. With the rest of the platoon ready to step in if needed, the first of the fire teams is going to move towards one of the small buildings. I'm going to have them stop outside so they can get a chance to look through the window and the door for any occupants before moving in. The Syrian heavy machine gun is continuing to pose a problem for 9 Platoon as it fires on their buildings. I have multiple light machine guns from my infantry squads firing back, but as the range is anywhere from 400 to 500 meters, they're having a bit of trouble suppressing the Syrians, and the HMG is able to sporadically return fire. Eventually, a lucky shot lands and takes out the gunner, which resolves the issue. Moments later, a Syrian infantry squad is spotted moving up the main road and entering a building directly behind where the heavy machine gun was. They take a small amount of ineffective fire before disappearing inside. There is suddenly a large explosion along the irrigation ditch, which 7 Platoon is currently starting to move towards. A few seconds later, the source is spotted, an RPG in a building across the central field. 8 Platoon does their job and opens fire, suppressing the RPG gunner who disappears from the window. However, he's either shifted to the other window or there's more than one inside, as a second shot is heard. The second shot sails over the top of 7 Platoon as they begin to enter the ditch. I brought up 60mm mortars to the area to see if they can get some bombs into the buildings across the field, as 8 Platoon keeps up some light fire to suppress the RPGs. The mortars appear to have attracted some attention, as one of my infantry squads spots a Syrian machine gun deployed on the school roof moments before it opens fire on the mortar team. I suffer my first casualties of the battle as one of the mortar crew goes down to the machine gun fire. I'm not confident that the RPGs across the field are taken care of, despite not seeing any sign of them for a couple minutes. So I've brought over the ATGM teams to fire missiles into the buildings. The first shot comes up short and slams into the ground in front of the building, but the next few will score direct hits. Since there's no sign of enemy vehicles, buildings are the next best target for these missiles. 7 Platoon has also moved into the irrigation ditch, and Phase 2 is nearly ready to begin. It's unlikely that a 60mm mortar will do much damage to the roof of a building, but there's not really anything else for them to shoot at, so I might as well throw them in for some extra suppression. 7 Platoon begins Phase 2 of the attack plan and starts moving up the irrigation ditch, although some of them have missed the memo about using the ditch as cover and hop out to run alongside the ditch. This coincides with the return of the Apache, this time focusing on the closer buildings in the south compounds. It finds some targets and unleashes a volley of cannon fire into a building. As the platoon continues to advance up the ditch, they catch sight of infantry in the buildings again. It seems like the missiles and mortar rounds were insufficient to deal with the threat. Some of the platoon stops to open fire while a small force continues to push forward in order to get into close range where their weapons will be more effective. So far, the Syrians appear sufficiently pinned and don't return fire.
Fire for effect, over.
At this point, I've decided I have no desire to fight through the easternmost buildings in the south, where the tall walls will limit the ability to support infantry assaulting the buildings. That means it's time to level the entire area, and a strike from the 155mm artillery comes in to do exactly that. While the buildings where the RPGs were spotted have been suppressed, the next building over contains a few Syrian soldiers who open fire on the approaching 7 Platoon, causing my second casualty of the battle. 8 Platoon is quick to make the spot and returns fire, suppressing the Syrians and preventing further losses. Once again, the range is a bit too far for 8 Platoon to reliably get kills, but they can keep the Syrians pinned while 7 Platoon closes in. There's still a few ATGMs left, so they fire into the newly revealed Syrian position, as they should be more effective than rifle fire. The first fire teams from 7 Platoon have made it to the bend of the irrigation ditch and are nearly in position to start clearing buildings. While in the background, the artillery continues to rain down, collapsing the tall walls and entire buildings. The first buildings that need to be cleared are where the RPG gunners fired from. While those buildings have been hit with a lot of fire, including missiles and mortars, one fire team will advance while another provides suppressing fire in case the RPG team somehow survived. The advancing fire team is first stopping at the windows outside the closest building to check for occupants before moving inside. This will also give another squad time to continue up the irrigation ditch to cover the doors into the building. With the second squad in position to cover the back half of the compounds, the assaulting fire team moves forward over the low stone wall and enters the first building. They find it entirely empty. They cautiously advance into the attached second building and find the corpse of a lone RPG gunner, but nothing else. Between the missiles, mortars, and vast amounts of small arms fire, that one RPG gunner cost a lot of money to take down. The fire team continues to hunt forward slowly towards the windows to get a look at the next building, which had some Syrian soldiers in it. They haven't been spotted since the ATGMs hit the building, so there's a chance they were killed. That does not seem to be the case though, as a Syrian soldier is spotted. As the Canadians open fire, more Syrians are spotted and the close-range firefight picks up in intensity. The supporting squad in the ditch joins in, putting an overwhelming amount of fire on the Syrians, several of which decide they've had enough and surrender. The final squad and fire team of 7 platoon had been moving up to join the initial team in the buildings and attract the attention of some soldiers in the building that had been hit by the Apache. The Syrians are quickly pinned in return. Fire teams from 8 platoon and 7 platoon have moved across the central field to the 2 buildings closer to the town in order to get some additional recon on Tall Tamir. What they've discovered is exactly what I had anticipated: a Syrian strongpoint set up in the buildings overlooking the gap between the outskirt buildings and the town itself. This will need to be eliminated before any attempt at crossing the gap into the town. Both 8 and 9 platoons are able to fire upon the stronghold, but it'll likely be up to 7 platoon to close in enough to neutralize it entirely. In order to bolster 7 platoon a bit, the squad of assault pioneers have joined them and have now taken up a position behind a stone wall. Most of 7 platoon plus the pioneers open fire on an occupied building, and it's enough of a shock to the Syrians inside that they've wisely decided to surrender. With 7 platoon making good progress moving up the south compounds, it's time to focus on breaking down the Syrian strongpoint in the 2-story building. I could hit it with artillery, but I've already used up around half of the time in the battle, so I'm starting to get concerned about having enough left to assault the objective. I've opted to expend the rest of my mortar ammunition on the buildings, which mostly damages the stone fences, while I maneuver some forces closer. The second half of the squad that made it to the building at the far end of the central field attempts to cross, since it's a bit better of a position to suppress the 2-story building. An RPG shot from the edge of town lands a direct hit on one of the soldiers, taking him out. The squad inside the building starts working to suppress where the RPG shot came from, although there's no clear spot on the shooter. This should allow the surviving 2 men from the fire team to make it to the building where they can put their light machine gun to use, once they recover from being pinned. At the same time, the rest of 7 platoon, along with the pioneers, are continuing to advance through the buildings. While they meet no resistance in the buildings themselves, their movement has been noticed from the town and some shots begin to get exchanged. My first artillery strike failed to take down the taller walls, so the platoon is going to hold here for a few minutes and another strike is almost ready. Until then, they can trade fire with Syrians in the town and maybe get a few lucky hits in. Most of the Syrians in the buildings have been suppressed and stopped firing, so to save ammo I have my forces stop firing as well. The artillery is on target this time, and over the next few minutes smashes the remaining buildings. The Apache that's been floating around also decides to put some rockets into the 2-story building, although the majority of them fall short. The tall wall has somehow survived the artillery strikes, but the buildings have not, so that's as good as it will get at this point. A pioneer fire team moves to a building where they can observe the rubble and finds a few scattered groups of Syrian soldiers who try to flee. They're not going to get very far. The Apache comes in with another rocket strike and collapses the two-story building, which should take care of the issue and allow Phase 3 to start, the attack into the objective. With the Syrian strongpoint overlooking the gap between the north compounds and the objective seemingly destroyed, 8 Platoon begins their crossing. The 60mm mortars drop smoke, but it's a bit windy and the smoke blows away without being very useful. The first elements of the platoon stop in a building on the edge of the central field and come under fire from some survivors of the collapsed building. More survivors than I expected. With only rubble as cover instead of the intact building, it doesn't take long for the Syrians to start taking losses. This does mean I will need to get 7 Platoon to push farther forward so they can do a final clear of the area and make sure there's no more lingering Syrians. As they move into the rubble, a Syrian squad in a remaining intact building opens fire. The Canadians are fairly exposed here, but the Syrians probably aren't in the best mental state at the moment and fail to land any hits despite the close range. They are quickly overwhelmed by the volume of fire they receive in return and surrender. With the only visible Syrians surrendering, the pioneers and one fire team start moving to storm the buildings. More Syrians hiding in the rubble pop up and fire, but are quickly suppressed and surrender shortly after. The assaulting force isn't out of danger yet, as Syrians from the town begin to fire on them as well. Some of the soldiers stop to fire back, leaving them standing in the open, which is not an ideal position when there's a nice building only a few meters away. I get a bit of a lucky break and no one gets hit. 8 Platoon and the rest of 7 Platoon have spotted where the fire is coming from and have started putting heavy fire of their own into the occupied buildings. It looks like some of the two-story buildings can see the approach, so they will need to be neutralized or suppressed first. At this point, I'm feeling a little bit stuck. I can't use artillery or the Apache in the town since the mission briefing was clear not to destroy buildings in the town itself. My smoke attempt also failed as there's too much wind. 7 Platoon is moved up as far as it can and is laying down fire, and 8 Platoon is firing as well, but due to range and the Syrians being inside buildings, I can't tell if it's having much effect. Other than the Syrians aren't really shooting back, but are they dead or simply suppressed and hiding? With the clock ticking down, I wait for some smoke from the 155mm batteries and hope the larger cloud will last longer. The spotting rounds are wildly off target, and I can't wait any longer, so 8 Platoon makes the charge across the open, with 7 and 9 Platoons firing into the buildings on the outskirts of town. It's riskier than I would have liked, but I'm down to around 25 minutes left now, and the hardest fighting is still to come. Luck is with me again as 8 Platoon reaches the first buildings without taking any losses. At this point, my plan is standard urban combat. Concentrate overwhelming force to suppress and destroy the enemy, and hope an RPG doesn't ruin your day before the enemy gets pinned. As the final soldiers of 8 Platoon stream into the buildings, I do lose one man to a shot coming from the north, but several Syrian positions are quickly destroyed. I now have a foothold in the objective, and I can start pushing farther in. As 8 Platoon presses forward, some of the surviving Syrians that were pinned are now getting spotted and subjected to massive amounts of automatic fire at close range. The Canadians are also firing their anti-tank weapons and rifle grenades, which is probably going to cost me some score for damaging buildings, but with time running low, I'd rather clear the Syrians quickly, and the explosives are a big help with that. The remaining Syrians in the immediate area have begun to surrender, and my troops are getting close enough to catch sight of some of the destruction they've caused. Since 8 Platoon is now clearing past the edge of the objective, 9 Platoon isn't needed for suppressing fire anymore and also begins to cross the gap. 8 Platoon lost the soldier to fire from this building, so a 9 Platoon squad advances on it, and the lone Syrian inside surrenders. I'm expecting to encounter some resistance from across the street, so 8 Platoon is moving into position so that multiple squads can move adjacent to the street at once to maximize my firepower. With everyone in position, they advance into the buildings adjacent to the street. That's when the nightmare scenario happens, and a Syrian RPG shot strikes the building with a large amount of Canadians inside. And somehow, the troops make it out with only some wounds and no casualties. The Syrians are not as lucky, and their casualties start stacking up quickly under the barrage of small arms fire. The closer building directly across the street is wiped out, but another squad of Syrians further up the road are at an angle that makes it a bit more difficult for my troops to get shots on them. The soldiers reposition a bit and pick different windows, and they quickly build up fire superiority. The Syrians are suppressed, take a few casualties, and then the remainder surrender. 7 Platoon is still able to provide a bit of suppressing fire to cover 8 Platoon as long as they are moving along the edges of the town or near some of the uncleared 2-story buildings. This enables the squad from 8 Platoon to continue advancing and clearing buildings, finishing off any pinned Syrians they encounter. I'm hoping to get the squad into the 2-story building to the northeast of them, then send a couple scouts up to the roof to get a better view of the rest of the town. Generally, going on the rooftops in Shock Force 2 is a poor idea unless they have a low wall around the roof like these 2-story buildings do. The buildings that don't have the walls are a bit of a death trap, as any infantry up there is very visible and has no protection. Also, it's not a great idea to run multiple squads into a building at once like this, but I'm reasonably confident that the street is secure, and I'm running low on time, so potentially deadly shortcuts will have to be taken. The next problem I've encountered is the door to the building I want to enter is on the opposite side of a low wall, which will leave the squad exposed to fire as they hop over and run in the door. A fire team from the Pioneers has spent the last couple minutes running across the battlefield in order to plant a charge and blow up the wall section. I'm doing it this way to kill or pin any occupants of the building before entering, as the building is quite large and storming it directly would be difficult with potential enemies in each segment. With the charge detonated, the squad rushes into the building, but comes under fire from Syrians in a different building. This was not going to plan, and the squad is now in a very dangerous position as they're taking a lot of fire and don't have any support at the moment. As the exchange continues, a rifle grenade shot explodes in the window of the Syrian building, killing at least 2. This is enough to cause the rest of them to surrender. Back at the other building, a second squad from 9 Platoon storms through the breach as the Syrians inside recover from being pinned by the blast. They are quickly eliminated. The exhausted Pioneers are still trying to catch their breath. Meanwhile, the squad on the rooftop gets spotted and comes under fire almost immediately. The shots are coming from a building behind a tall wall, so there's not much opportunity for any other squads to help out. The squad on the rooftop alternates between being pinned and returning fire, with neither side able to get any kills. There's only 10 minutes left, so the advance must continue. 9 Platoon and the slightly recovered but still very tired Pioneers continue to sweep through buildings. While there's a few scattered Syrians to fire at, most of the buildings in this section of town are full of corpses or surrendered Syrians. I considered moving the rooftop squad back inside the building since they were struggling to pin down the Syrians firing on them, but most of the squad managed to recover and get into better firing positions when the Syrian light machine gun was reloading. Since they haven't taken any casualties yet, I decided to leave them where they are for now. As the battle enters the final minutes, 8 Platoon joins 9 Platoon in moving towards the final pockets of Syrian resistance. At this point, the objective area itself is firmly under Canadian control, so it's mostly a case of mopping up the remaining Syrian forces. The rooftop engagement continues, with my soldiers finally getting themselves into a nice firing line and putting significant amounts of fire towards the Syrians. The Syrians so far seem undeterred and continue to return fire. It's been several minutes of exchanging fire and there hasn't been any casualties on either side. With no friendly forces nearby, the Syrian surrender in the middle of the objective area completes. A squad from 9 Platoon is continuing to move forward in an attempt to get to the occupied building, exchanging fire with the rooftop squad, but encounters another Syrian occupied building on the way. The Syrians take casualties almost immediately, and the remaining soldier surrenders. After that, the Syrians have had enough and the remaining force surrenders. This gives me a minor victory with 180 points to the Syrians' 102. I have 111 men okay, 5 killed and 2 wounded, while the Syrians have 25 men okay, 34 killed, 32 wounded, and 26 surrendered. I achieved all of my objectives and scored maximum points. However, the Syrian side did gain 25 bonus points due to the collateral damage on buildings. I suspect this was from the AT weapons and rifle grenades being used in the town. Overall, it was a very successful first mission of the campaign that posed a few interesting tactical problems due to the all-infantry force and the inability to reduce the entire town to rubble. Thanks for watching, everyone, and see you in the next one.